The 21st century electorate. And sorry, there was a pause there, so I just wanted to make sure. Uh, and it's an honor, privilege to introduce our first guest, who's going to be talking on very important issues. Allow me to introduce Professor Ms. Nazita Lajavardi, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2017, her Juris Doctorate from University of San Francisco School of Law in 2012, and her Bachelor of Arts from the University of California in Los Angeles in 2009. Her work focuses mainly on issues related to race and ethnic politics, political behavior, voting rights, and immigration. And right now, Ms. Lajavardi is on sabbatical in Sweden, and it's an honor and a privilege for Ms. Nazita Lajavardi to be as our first host. Welcome, Professor Lajavardi, and I'll give you the introduction. Now go ahead and you can start the program here.
Excellent. Thank you all. It's really a privilege to be here with you. I don't think Zoom has been easy on many people, but this has been one of the most wonderful parts of Zoom life, right? Is being able to share space like this all over the country. And so I feel incredibly privileged and honored to have the opportunity to be here with you and to meet all of you. So thank you so much for spending part of your Saturday here with me. As was just mentioned in that very kind introduction, I am a scholar of race and ethnicity as well as religious groups. I mostly study discrimination in American politics, discrimination of marginalized groups, and that doesn't necessarily have to be racial groups. It could be religious groups, sexual orientation minorities. It could be gender minorities. So really smaller populations that do not comprise of the majority population. Of course, we all have intersecting identities. We can, have one of our identities belong to the majority group and another one of our identities belong to the minority group. And so, this is to say that, studying race and ethnicity and religion, these are categories that are complex, that are not very easy to dissect so blatantly. We have to, I think, be a little bit more cognizant of how we talk about these groups and think about the cleavages within each of these groups. Each group really has an incredible amount of cleavages. My book that was released last year is on American Muslims. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about Muslims in America, and sort of give you a primer on their diversity and maybe sort of contrast in the end, what we think of Muslims, as part of the public and what's often portrayed to us. And so I would implore you as this talk goes on, who do you think Muslims are? And then I'm going to kind of give you some statistics on who they are. And then sort of walk you through my book and sort of just give you the highlights of, when we examine discrimination that they face, what do we find? How do they fare in American democracy? These are questions that are important to those of us who care about the principles of our democracy. And so hopefully we'll kind of come to a conclusion. And in the Q&A, if you'd like, we can talk a little bit about the organizing work and the mobilization work that it would take for Muslims, I think, to face better prospects in American democracy. And also I can sort of highlight at least what I know is ongoing with that pertains to that. Okay, so
Wonderful.
Let's go ahead and get started. Yeah. All right, everyone can see my screen, I hope.
Yes.
Excellent. So who are American Muslims? Well, there is an estimated 1.6 to 2.1 billion Muslim adherents across the world. And taking that number into account, it comes to surmise that Islam actually constitutes the second largest group behind of Christianity. And so the fact that it's also the fastest growing religion in the world today should have us think about the relevance of Muslims in our global discourse as well as in our national discourse. Muslims are forecasted to increase by 35% in the next 20 years globally. The Pew Research Center does some incredible work documenting different political phenomena, but one of their strengths is to survey Muslim Americans. And in their work in 2017, they estimated that 3.45 million Muslims were living in America. But the reality is that actually this is a really difficult estimate for us to get, because the true size of the Muslim American population is rather unknown to us, because the US Census does not collect any data on religious affiliation. I'm gonna come back to this over and over again. What are the challenges in studying Muslim Americans? What are the challenges in understanding their experiences? It comes back to the fact that we actually don't know how many there are in the United States. But here's what we do know. We know that US Muslims are newcomers. Pew study found that between 1992 and 2012, approximately 1.7 million Muslims entered the United States as legal permanent residents. And that number is a vast and high jump from the 50,000 individuals who came in 1992 and the 100,000 individuals that were coming in 2012. The reality, however, though, when you think of Muslims in America, it's important to recall that Muslims have been in the US since the founding of the country. They arrived as enslaved Africans, and 30% of enslaved Africans who came to the United States were of Muslim faith. So that is that Muslims have been in the US for at least 400 years. Here are some insights from this great survey that Pew ran in 2017. I just have to say that this is the third survey they've run of Muslims in the post 9/11 world, and it's the most representative sample that we have for those of us who study this population. So we're really fond of it. In that survey, they found, here just sort of looking at this left-hand panel, they found that only 24% of Muslims in the US are US born with US born parents. So 24% of American Muslims were born in the US themselves and have parents that were both born in the US. So in fact, the reality is that most Muslims are immigrants and were born abroad. 58% of Muslims are immigrants who were born abroad, and only 18% of US Muslims are like me. So those who were born in the United States, but whose parents were born abroad. That means that together, we really can't be thinking about US Muslims without thinking about how migration and immigration policy affects them. Turning to the second panel on the right, there's a great deal of racial diversity among US Muslims. So you can see here that 41% of US Muslims identify as white, but as you'll see, this white category is a bit misleading because it encompasses those from the Arab world, from the Middle East, from North Africa.
Yeah, we consider ourselves white.
Not all, some do, but not all. 20% consider themselves Black, 28% identify with South Asian, 8% identify as Hispanic, and about 3% identify as other. Moreover, many Muslim immigrants arrived in the year 2000 or later. So recall that foreign-born US immigrants constitute about 58% of the US Muslim population. Well, a majority of these individuals, about 56% of them, arrived in the US in the year 2000 or later, making them recent arrivals. And only 35% of foreign-born Muslim immigrants came to the US between 1970 and 1999. Moreover, a large majority of US Muslims are citizens. So despite the fact that, 58 immigrants and were born abroad, a majority of Muslims that are foreign born are actually naturalized US citizens. So in the US Muslim population overall, 82% are citizens, but 69% of the foreign born population is also with American citizenship. All right, so another important fact to know about Muslims is that no single country of origin constitutes more than 15% of the foreign-born US Muslim population. This is a bit different than in Europe, for instance, where the colonial histories are targeting certain countries, and so their immigrant arrivals are coming from a certain part of the world. In the US, I think what this table shows is that Muslims have immigrated from a number of different areas, and our racial categories are in fact quite reductive. So if you have a look at the right-hand column, you can see that 42, so the first right-hand column here, 42% were of US Muslims were born in the US, 20% were born in South Asia, 27% were born in the Middle East or other Asian country, 5% were from Sub-Saharan Africa, 2% in Europe, and 2% in the Americas outside of the US. Two final demographic points. First, the number of US Muslims has grown substantially from 2007 to 2017. In 2007, there were about 2.35 million Muslims. And in 2017, there was about 3.45 million Muslims, according to Pew. Second, Pew estimates that by 2040, Muslims will replace American Jews as the nation's second largest religious group after Christians. And by 2050, the US Muslim population is projected to reach 8.1 million, or 2.1% of the nation's total population, so nearly twice the share that it is today. Moreover, US Muslims are a relatively young population. Their median age is 35, while the median age among the general public is 47, indicating that their political voice will only likely grow as they reach voting age. So let's have a look now at my book. My book is called Outsiders at Home: The Politics of American Islamophobia. The motivation behind my book is to explore the status of Muslims in American democracy. I'm asking here, what is their status? How do they fare? What kind of representation do they experience? And I make an argument in this book. I argue that current hostility towards Muslim Americans in the American socio-political context is high, but that this hostility is nothing new. Muslims have long been portrayed as being in opposition to an elevated, democratic, and modern, quote, West. So the reality is that while there has been significant demographic shifts in this group's composition since their arrival in the 1600s, the fact that Muslims in America have been marginalized, this process, this experience has been manifest to different degrees and in different forms for centuries. And though the Islam that was brought to the United States by enslaved Africans did not endure very long, since many were forcibly converted to Christianity, there are traces of that old practice that actually endured to present day. There were actually efforts to practice Islam that persisted and were conducted in secret. So one thing that I find really remarkable is that there's an enclave of African Americans off the Georgia coast that maintained their faith until the early part of the 20th century, evidenced in the practice of the ring shout, which was originally inherited from enslaved Muslims. And it's a form of religious dance akin to like a Sufi ritual of circling around the Kaaba in Mecca. But, so putting that aside, despite this really long history of discrimination, despite the fact that Islam has been in the United States in one way or another for centuries, we have particular concern over the status of American Muslims in the United States today. In the post 9/11 era and well before the Trump presidency, the United States has endorsed or overseen legislation, policies, and interventions that have affected the lives of Muslims, both foreign and domestic. For instance, you can think of the Patriot Act, the establishment of Guantanamo Bay Prison, the Iraq War, the Abu Ghraib scandal, the creation of the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program. I mean, there's a number of reasons why we should be concerned about how they fared today. So you might ask, why should we be concerned about their status in recent times? Let me give you some reasons. First, political elites linked them with the 9/11 attacks. President George Bush, for example, visited the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. less than 1 week following the terrorist attacks. And he made some remarks to the adherents there. And I want to read this passage to you. And while the words and the intention is good, I think that the words, what they do is they link Muslims with the terrorist attacks, and they create a distinction between, quote, like ordinary Americans and Muslims, as though they cannot be synonymous. And really it creates a divergence between these two groups. Quote reads, Like the good folks standing with me, the American people were appalled and outraged at last Tuesday's attacks, and so were Muslims all across the world. Both Americans and Muslim friends and citizens, tax-paying citizens, and Muslims in nations were appalled and could not believe what we saw on our TV screens. These acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith. And it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That is not what Islam is about. Islam is about peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. Second, there were widespread surveillance programs and prolonged detentions that followed. So just for instance, the National Security Agency launched a warrantless national surveillance program that lasted from 2001 to 2007. And years after the unlawful program was launched, The Intercept actually reported that NSA and FBI had been covertly monitoring the emails of prominent Muslim Americans, confirming many Muslim suspicions that their calls and email communications had been subject to warrantless searches. There was even an effort by the NYPD to infiltrate the Yale Muslim Students Association. So putting aside the jurisdictional issues there of a New York City police department monitoring the activities of individuals who were located in a neighboring state. The fact that these students who were arguably at the highest levels of society, highest echelons, were being monitored and treated as suspect confirmed what many Muslims had been feeling at that time and were incredibly worried about and continue to be so today. There's also been a rise in anti-Muslim bias incidents and legislation. So let me explain. The Council of American Islamic Relations has on their website an opportunity, a portal, a site where individuals can report different hate crimes and bias incidents that occur to them that CARE then goes on to examine and help individuals with. And they shared their data with me. What you see here is a rise in the total number of hate crimes and bias incidents that were reported to CARE from 2014 to 2016, and then a slight decline in 2017 to 2018. What I find rather fascinating is the type of issues that individuals were complaining about. So in 2014, the number one bias incident that individuals were reporting were about employment. And then it was about FBI and other federal agencies, denial of religious accommodation, harassment, hate crime, state and local police. By 2015, the tide had really changed. The number 1 and 2 issues that were being reported had to do with harassment and hate crimes and harassment from the FBI and other federal agencies. And this trend remains in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, 2018. I also want to talk a little bit about anti-Sharia laws, which continue to be part of our national discourse, but actually have been on the rise for some time here. Anti-Sharia laws are laws that several states have passed or have attempted to pass. These are designed to prevent courts from applying Islamic or Sharia law, but really what they're written as doing is preventing the application of foreign or international law in rulings. But these laws are symbolic more than anything else. And that is because we have the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits the government from making any law that respects an establishment of religion and mandates that no religious tradition can be established on the basis of laws that apply to everyone. That's, of course, including any form of Sharia. These laws single out Sharia, and they argue that it solely violates the First Amendment by treating one belief system as suspect and doesn't include any others. And Sharia laws represent one form of institutionalized Islamophobia because they're simply ineffective. They actually don't do anything. There is really no point. No court is going to apply the laws of a foreign land because it would violate the Establishment Clause. However, these laws have been introduced into state legislatures. Between 2013 and 2017, 109 anti-Sharia laws were introduced into state legislatures. Between 2010 and 2017, as you can see here, 201 were introduced, 14 were enacted over this time period. So they have made a lot of headway and they have garnered a lot of support and have invoked quite a bit of fear about Muslim populations in states where they are being passed. And of course, you can't talk about anti-Muslim hostility without talking about the 2016 presidential campaign. This, of course, coincided with the Syrian refugee crisis as well as the rise of ISIS. So I want to remind you of some legislator comments that were made about Muslims in 2015, really when a lot of us started paying a great deal of attention, renewed attention to Muslims and their experiences. John Bennett, who's an Oklahoma State representative, he stated at the time, American Muslims are a cancer that must be cut out of America. David Bowers, who was the then mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, called for the registration and subsequent incarceration of Muslims in US internment camps. Ben Carson, who was a previous Republican presidential contender, compared Syrian refugees, many of whom are Muslim, to rabid dogs. Donald Trump's campaign in December 2015 came out with a statement that said Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what's going on. In 2016, Trump stated that the US must have surveillance of Muslims in this country, particularly at mosques. And Ted Cruz called for the wholesale policing of Muslim neighborhoods in the US in the wake of the Brussels attacks. And finally, of course, there is the Muslim ban, which began with one executive order, no less than 1 week after President Trump took office. He signed Executive Order 13769. It denied the citizens of 7 Muslim majority countries entry into the United States. After widespread condemnation, he followed with 2 more versions of this, quote, Muslim ban, which was challenged in the courts and made it to the Supreme Court and was actually upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. So I've shown you a lot of anecdotal signs, but these signs are quite limited. It could be that US Muslims' experiences in the American sociopolitical context are negative. And it seems like Muslim Americans may be one of the most politically and socially stigmatized groups in the United States. But this evidence that I've laid out for you is largely conjecture, and Muslim Americans remain woefully understudied. And so we need much more systematic and quantitative empirical research in a number of domains, especially in politics, to understand the political experiences and positionality that they have. And as I hinted earlier, there are some empirical limitations that comes with studying Muslim Americans. So first, we don't actually know the true size and composition of the US Muslim population. As I alluded earlier, there is no census category for religion because the white category in the census actually hides any variation in national origin that Muslims, particularly those from the Middle East, may want to highlight. So for those of you who don't know, the white category on the census encompasses those with backgrounds from the Middle East and North Africa. Moreover, few publicly available public opinion surveys on Muslims, Islam, or Muslim Americans exist before 9/11. So for those of us who are wondering, well, how did people see them before 9/11? Or what did they say about their experiences? Well, we have interviews and we have some work that's really qualitative based, but we don't know in terms of polling. You know, we weren't asking these questions prior to 9/11. So I wrote a book, and I'm going to highlight the different contributions that my book makes, and then we can open it to Q&A. My book, Outsiders at Home, conducts a number of comprehensive studies to examine how Muslims are treated in different domains in American democracy. These are domains that arguably are—
I want to record my pitch.
Excuse me? Sorry, okay, I thought somebody was saying something. So this book examines a number of domains that they're vital to their democratic inclusion. Okay, so here's the book outline. I begin by asking, how does anti-Muslim hostility matter for shaping candidate and policy support? Here, I develop a set of survey items that measure prejudice towards US Muslims called the Muslim American Resentment Scale. I next wonder about their political representation. I examine how Muslims fare in terms of substantive representation. For instance, are Muslims ignored by their elected representatives when they reach out to them to ask for assistance? Here, I conduct an experiment on all US state legislatures to examine whether they exhibit bias towards Muslims who ask them for constituent service.
We will not tolerate hate. We will not tolerate hate against any group, and we will not tolerate
Maureen, can you please mute your...
Can you please mute your, excuse me, can you please mute your mic? Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. So after examining political representation, I turned to the news media, and I examined how the news media has historically depicted Muslims foreign and domestic. I wonder how the news media portrayals also matter for shaping public attitudes. And in doing so, what I do is I actually collect and amass news coverage from 1992 to 2016, all news broadcasts that aired on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. And so I take the universe of every broadcast that aired on these three channels throughout this time period. And of course, the transcripts become available at different times because only CNN existed in 1992 and Fox and NBC came into fruition towards the end of the 90s. But here what I'm doing is I'm examining the volume of coverage as well as whether the coverage is negative and positive, and then as well as whether negative coverage and how negative coverage compared to positive coverage changes people's attitudes towards American Muslims. I then ask about Muslim candidate support. So if given the opportunity, would the mass public actually vote for a Muslim candidate? Are Muslim candidates likely to experience what we call descriptive representation, representation by individuals who belong to their groups? And here I do what we call survey experiments. In a survey, I randomize people into viewing different elected officials and ask whether they would vote for them and vary the attributes of those potential candidates. And finally, the book concludes by asking about US Muslims themselves. So all these other components are thinking a lot about the mass public or the news media or legislators, but what about Muslims themselves? And here I ask, to what extent do Muslim Americans themselves report experiencing societal and institutional discrimination? And here I'm just examining the extent to which in surveys Muslims report discrimination levels. So I'm going to preview some of my answers now and I'll conclude. Turning to public opinion, I find that across numerous policies, Muslim American resentment or anti-Muslim hostility is stronger in its predictive power than any other previously proposed item or measure for group attitudes. In fact, I show that across numerous policies, Muslim American resentment is stronger in its predictive power than other previously proposed means, like favorability items or stereotype items. And it's important for predicting candidate support and vote choice. In the second study, I essentially conduct 2 experiments on state legislators, and I find that actually there's a vast substantive representation discrimination. The voices of American Muslims are systematically ignored by their elected representatives, and Muslim political integration does not seem to improve with more elevated socioeconomic status. And so actually what I find here is that though Muslims strongly identify as Democrats, they don't have very many strong allies among Democratic representatives and are also, while they receive some representation from Democrats, they're still quite ignored by their Democratic representatives compared to Republicans. So the implications, I think, of these studies are really disconcerting. Muslims are being systematically ignored by their elected representatives, especially by those who they view as allies. Turning to the news media, I find that cable news coverage of Muslims is negative over a 20-year period. The volume is high and it rivals that of other groups, of other stigmatized groups. So media coverage of Muslims is akin in volume to that of African Americans and Latinos in particular. And also exposure to negative media about Muslims generates negative attitudes. So the fact that people are often viewing negative portrayals of Muslims is changing attitudes towards them as well. I find also that the prospects for descriptive representation are low. When Muslims run as Democrats, the probability of voting for them is quite low. They're still quite low for Republicans, but the probability of voting for a Muslim Republican is a bit higher than that of a Muslim Democrat, but still relatively low in absolute terms. finally, I think probably most importantly, US Muslims experience a great deal of societal and institutional discrimination, and they worry a lot about their visibility. They regularly avoid public places. And in response to the Trump Muslim ban, they report feeling more visible and open to attack. One person even remarked that they thought they were going to die. So in conclusion, this book overall asked, how do Muslim Americans fare in American democracy? And, answering this question is really complex and broad. And so you have to take a multifaceted approach in doing so. But I'm an attorney, and so I think a lot about the totality of the evidence. And I would argue that the totality of the evidence in this book, at least together, provides some empirical evidence of the degenerating situation of Muslim Americans in the American racial hierarchy. And I think it shows that the group situation is rather far worse than we might have previously imagined. But that this discrimination also is not unnoticed and it's not unconsequential. Muslim Americans are deprived of fair treatment in the sociopolitical context, and they're acutely aware of this. And they know of their worsening situation in the American political arena. And so I think the totality of all these results together shows a great deal of discrimination and hostility in the American sociopolitical context, and I think raises questions for the inclusion of American Muslims in American democracy. And with that, I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Lajavardi, for a wonderful presentation of detailed information on the American Islamophobia dynamics and the challenges that it presents to Americans and Muslim Americans by and large. So first of all, I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions, they can send a question on the chat and be happy to read those questions. And the other part is that Nadia just posted a link to the book, which I highly recommend to get. I believe it's also available on Amazon in a paperback as well. So I would highly recommend, if anybody's interested on these issues or to understand the more complex dynamics of Islamophobia and how it's impacting Muslim American communities, I would highly recommend to get that book, or recommend anybody that you think might be interested as well. So again, anybody that have questions, please go ahead and send it to the chat. Professor, I had a question. Thank you again for such a wonderful presentation and being involved in so much of issues related to anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia. In terms of the government and law enforcement, the FBI, especially, I am well aware of the case and situation in New York where the New York Police Department and FBI were spying Muslims going beyond the jurisdiction. And I guess there was a Yale University outward bound group that they were spying and actually had informants in that group. Do you know I know the Associated Press was the first one to break that news. Has there been any end to that or investigation? Has there been any accountability in that area?
Not to my knowledge. I'm not well versed on the investigation, so I might not be the person to be able to answer that. But I often, go back and look at, what's come to light after time. I think there takes a lot of investigative journalism to even be able to pinpoint any of these patterns. I don't think Yale is alone in this. I don't think this was unique to Yale. I don't think this was unique to the NYPD. There's data out there showing that Muslims think that their phone calls are being monitored. And this is something that anecdotally you might hear, especially in the post 9/11 era, people were hearing clicks on their phones, and they felt that their phone calls were being listened to. And so there was this norm of saying, I'm going to hang up and call you back because I can hear something. And so this was something that was ongoing in the Muslim community. But then to see, in surveys, when you go and ask the population, a larger subset of the population, swaths of the population, well, was this just a certain network of people, or how common is this? Overwhelmingly Muslims experience this. Like they report having experienced this kind of surveillance. And so it's not just paranoia. It's not just subject to certain groups. This is something that's widespread. That is
systemic.
It's systemic. And then imagine, of course, sorry to go on about this, but imagine you're a Muslim person And your Muslimness gets and attracts FBI attention. But let's also say you're an immigrant. And so you might attract ICE attention. Let's say you're undocumented. You might attract ICE attention. Let's say you're Black and you might attract the attention of like local and state level police just being Black on the street. So there's actually multiple, layers of law enforcement that a Muslim person in America can come into contact with. And I think we should be like incredibly clear that this FBI law enforcement type of surveillance is not unique to Muslims, but is traditionally what we pair with Muslims. But there's in fact multiple levels of law enforcement involvement in Muslim lives.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have our first question I have from Nadia, and the question is, can you tell us about how American politicians take Muslim and African American voters' issues for granted that you in your book?
Yeah, so my book is quite critical of Democrats, but I mean, of course, it's critical of Republicans. I think that's a very easy but incredibly low bar. But it's critical of Democrats too, and I'm gonna explain why a little bit. So, during the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton, I believe it was in October, in one of the debates, characterized the utility of American Muslims as being America's ears and eyes on the front line. Our utility in this country is inherently linked to terrorism, to violence, to barbaric ways of harming society, not being constructive members of society, but being eyes and ears for potential violence, terrorism. And that word terrorism, evil, it's to say that, and I think the intention is to be like, look, they're so great. They're here. They can help us. It's wonderful. Yeah, but you've created a distinction between them and us because you've said that their utility lies in the fact that they can stop a terrorist attack? Is that what you're saying? And so it's incredibly distressing that in a campaign that became very much focused on American Muslims, very much centered on actually Muslims foreign and domestic, that Hillary Clinton's campaign had an opportunity to fight back and to nuance a bit how we think of American Muslims and to very much make them as part of the fabric of America. But she didn't do that. And I think that was incredibly harmful. But that's one candidate. Another critique, of course, is that in my book, I find, that when Muslims are asking for help from their legislators, they're systematically ignored in general. But like Democrats are not offering them, their legislators are not offering them any more services than Republicans are for the most part, unless they're elites, like super, super elites. So it's a bit troubling, I think there are certainly politicians out there that, especially with the rise of a progressive arm of the Democratic movement, there's been a move towards being more inclusive towards American Muslims, especially as a sort of like younger group of Muslims becomes much more involved in politics. This 18% of people I was talking about who were born in the US to foreign parents, like those people, as they're sort of, rising and growing up and, becoming more involved in politics, those people are sort of helping to create the type of coalitions and relationships that are necessary, I think, to maybe changing some of our dialogue and our expectations of what it means to be formally included and belong in American democracy. So those are just a couple examples. I will sort of just finally say that I was doing interviews in Congress, but back then we had 2 African-American members of Congress who were male and identified as Muslim. And I spoke to one of their staffers and I asked, I walked into the office and I saw just really great like imagery, posters, beautiful art that was centered on Blackness. And I asked, well, there's nothing here about like Islamic art or like being Muslim. Like, why, why not like showcase that? And the staffer said to me, the congressman is African American first. And that was like a cue for me, that, okay, it's clearly, a strategic decision that the legislator is making to appeal to constituents. So that was an interesting experience, at least as a as a PhD student walking around the halls of Congress.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Because I guess have a leading question to that is that there seems to be a lot of symbolism, of course, in Democratic Party, towards Muslim. Biden had obviously a message to the American Muslims, and even Hillary Clinton in convention, she invited Mr. Khan, the attorney, where he showed the book, constitutional book, challenging Donald Trump. But in substance, a lot of Muslims do feel they're lacking, especially also in foreign policy. I mean, just recently with the issue with Palestine and Israel, United States opposed 3 ceasefire resolutions. So somehow people feel that somehow plays into that sort of, not being anti-Muslim directly, but the issues related to Muslims abroad, which are obviously affect the people, American Muslims here, and in hindsight affects the voting record, where a lot of people seem to be feeling left out
Yeah.
of the issues that they're so concerned about, which only not affecting Muslim Americans, but affects Jewish communities and by and large the entire region.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of symbolic reaching out, but I would argue like absolutely not enough. I mean, if you look at the convention, the party convention this year or 2020, it was largely leaving out the Muslim population. We were not front and center as a group, and I sort of would challenge the notion that that the father of the fallen soldier was an olive branch to the Muslim community. To me, that was like the most performative face of a Muslim. Look, he's the father of a fallen soldier. That's as American as you can get. He didn't have to be. The fact that that's the one person who can prove his Americanness and his loyalty and his patriotism means that that's the bar. That's what it takes to be slightly accepted. And that I challenge that. I don't think it should be. I think a person who loves their country can also be critical of their country. And to me, that was, again, it leaves out a subsection of the Muslim community who doesn't have that kind of history in this country, doesn't have that kind of belongingness. And so I would urge us all to question, what was performative about that? Was that an olive branch of the Muslim community, or was that a way of making some people less afraid of Muslims? I don't know if, I guess I would say I don't think we need to do that. And in terms of foreign policy, I mean, I think there's a generational divide there. I think Muslims with, who have ties to, were born in a different country are going to privilege foreign policy. It's going to be important for them when they vote. That's just a policy issue that they care about. But for younger Muslims, especially those who are born in the United States, it's less of an issue. So there's also like two different lines to straddle. But when it comes at least to Israel-Palestine, it was this time around, it was very interesting to see how the American public had deviated from traditional reactions. But I would say the global public had changed. And you can see that, right, with the change in the Israeli government. You can see with the coalitions that were built, certainly it was unsustainable. And, I think as Americans, we have to question, what legacy we want to leave behind in this world, what kind of footprint we want to have. And certainly I would say that on at least those issues, I think there is a pulse in the American electorate that wants us to make better decisions.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So in your book, you talk about a lot of interesting topics. What is your message to the younger Muslim population, especially American born, where now we're seeing, especially after 9/11 unfortunate events, we saw more and more activism, more and more people going into law school that felt that they had a responsibility now to engage in a more constructive and productive way. So, do you talk about in your book what responsibility bears on our younger Muslim American generation, not only in terms of just being part of a party, but in terms of a civic engagement and being involved with the government issues, local issues, municipal issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I would say this for all young people, not just American Muslims, but I think it's very important to be active. It's very important to participate in politics and our democracy. I think like a lot of people, I sit up at night and I worry about American democracy. I worry about what's happening. And, as an attorney, I took a pledge to defend the Constitution and uphold it.
Right.
I took that pledge with all of my heart, with all of my intention. That's a commitment that I will never back down from. That's something that's very important to me. But I think somehow along the way, like that pledge, that faith, that commitment to the principles, at least the guiding principles that make America America are being lost. They're being reinterpreted, in different ways. And we're all kind of going into our echo chambers. And I think young people really have an opportunity here to make some headway. So just for like comparison, right now, millennials constitute just as big of a voting bloc as do boomers. So why are we letting, an older generation drive our policies? Why don't we vote? Why don't we participate? We should. We have the exact amount of power. Like, we can do this. But of course, information costs are high and money is clearly central to politics, and younger people are less likely to have information and stability and access and resources and power, and all those things matter.
Yeah.
But for the American Muslim population, I think what's been really remarkable is the coalitions that they've built. There is a very clear coalition with also like younger members of, the Jewish community, especially, which I think has been very important, the Latinx, African American, Native, as well as LGBTQ communities. These coalitions are central. They're central. And I think that moving away from this mentality that these political battles have to be fought alone, and into much more of a coalition, arm in arm approach has been very fruitful for American Muslims. You see record number of Muslims running for political office. They're not winning all the time, but they're running, and that's a start.
Mm. It's interesting. It's interesting you talked about the Jewish community collaboration, which is really important because and I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that when Bernie Sanders was running, he gained a lot of support because unfortunately, with the false narrative and rhetoric that Muslims are somehow anti-Semitic, which are not, vast majority of Muslims really supported Bernie Sanders. So what did it resonate with the American Muslims? I think that even in Michigan during 2016, a Jewish coalition actually tweeted that if it wasn't for the Muslim Americans voting, Bernie would have not won Michigan, if I'm not wrong. So what's really interesting. What did Bernie Sanders? I mean, not only the American Muslim, but I think an entire generation of progressive. I think he, it kind of aroused people from. But I was really interested to know what was the connection there that really kind of motivated so many American Muslims to support his policies.
Well, I think that
continues to believe that children should learn.
Can somebody please mute their? Thank you. Can you please mute your mic? Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. So I would say that there's a lot of experiences that American Jews and American Muslims have that are similar. And sometimes experiences of discrimination and seeing another group be marginalized and extending an olive branch to one another and holding hands through those experiences can really bring groups together. And I think that in the wake of the 2016 election, what you saw was a group of, you saw American Jews be targeted by hate crimes similarly as American Muslims. And that shared experience,
Hmm.
and the fact that these groups, you know, helped each other and supported each other and, you know, really, really were going through similar experiences, created the sort of foundations for coalition building. And it was happening before, but I think really uniquely throughout the campaign, especially into 2017, American Jews and the hate crimes they faced were just astronomical, astronomical.
Yeah.
As were American Muslims. And so that experience, I think, really brought these two groups together.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. We're winding down now. So again, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put that question in a chat. And if I don't see anything, then we're going to wrap it up. I know it's very late in Sweden. And Professor Lajavardi, you've been so kind to carve the time out of your sabbatical to be on this really important conversation. I think that we need to have more of these conversations. And I would highly recommend, again, anybody, if they have not read the book, to please buy the book from the Cambridge Academics website, or you can go to Amazon and order the book. They have a paperback as well. This is really an amazing presentation, and I think this really begs the question for all of us, not only American Muslims, how we can come together and work together, shoulder to shoulder, collaborate to make our country safer for everybody and to make our democracy and democratic institutions to stay strong and to protect our individual rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. So thank you very much for your presentation. Does anybody have any questions for last time? It's the last call. And if not, I'm going to hand it over to Nadia to end this presentation. Again, Professor, it's been an honor and privilege to be part of this conversation. I look forward to speaking with you, and perhaps I can get some tips that can help my work and our work that we're doing. It's been a pleasure meeting you virtually.
The pleasure has been all mine. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nadia, it's all yours from here.
Okay. Thank you so much. We wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you especially to Nazita for all your efforts and your research, and we look forward to future partnerships. Thank you again.
Thank you all. Thank you all for spending your Saturdays here.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.